Welcome to this edition of Innovative Conversations, which is a production of the Center for Innovative Practices at the Begun Center at Case Western Reserve University here in Cleveland, Ohio. And I'm your host, Patrick Kanary. Today's discussion, I think, is incredibly timely and important. And we're going to explore some issues related to the concepts, experiences, implementation related to equity and inclusion. Our two guests today have made significant contributions in this area. And I think what we're going to do here also is to highlight some of the topical areas that are currently being offered through the Center for Innovative Practices on equity and inclusion. So this is maybe in some ways a little bit of a preview. What I'm going to ask you to do is that if you're interested in registering for any of the sessions, which run from about now through, I believe, June, I want to say, and each has a really nice description of what the content's going to be. So I think you'll find that really interesting. So if you go to www.ihbtohio.org, that's the front page. And if you go down and click on the article on the front page under Inclusion and Equity, that'll take you to registration and further information. I will say that the detailed biographical sketches of my guest today, our guest today, will also be available online. And I'm going to give you a very abbreviated version. They both are incredibly accomplished folks. And so we want to get to the conversation. So Dr. Kynetta Sugar McFarlane is a licensed clinical psychologist with over 14 years of experience in the provision of mental health services to children, adolescents, and families in multiple settings and systems. Dr. McFarlane has also been recognized in federal court as an expert in the area of trauma. Throughout her career, Dr. McFarlane has provided training related to behavioral health services to clinicians, providers, and supervisors across systems of care. Dr. McFarlane is now the System of Care Equity and Inclusion Coordinator for the Center for Innovative Practices. And we'll talk a little bit about that at Case Western Reserve University. She is an expert on the Project ECHO team, which does case consultations for multi-system youth at the Northeast Ohio Medical University. Dr. McFarlane has spoken throughout Ohio and on national platforms and international audiences on issues related to trauma, culture, and gender diversity. So Kynetta, welcome. Very pleased to have you here. Next, we have Dr. Bobbi Beale. Bobbi is a clinical psychologist and co-director of the Center for Innovative Practices and the Child and Adolescent Behavioral Health Center of Excellence at Case Western Reserve University. Dr. Beale has over 30 years of practice and experience in trauma, resilience, system of care, and behavioral health treatments for kids, youth, and families, specializing in intensive home-based treatment and adventure therapy. She spends most of her time training, consulting, and providing technical assistance across Ohio to support behavioral health providers of multi-system youth in family services. So welcome, Bobbi.
Thank you, Patrick.
So great to have you both here. I chuckle only because when I think of all the time that you have and don't have to do all of those things.
Yeah.
To you as well, Kynetta. So I'm grateful that we're carving out a little bit of your time for us to talk about inclusion and equity. So Bobbi, I'll just start real quick. I think it's really interesting to note that you have identified a person, a coordinator, for this position. So this System of Care, Equity and Inclusion Coordinator. Say a little bit about that role, kind of what brought you to the place where you felt this needed to be identified as a specific role?
Yes, I think that at the Center for Innovative Practices, we've always tried to walk that line of being aware of some of the inequities out there, and certainly we're aware of inequities around poverty and frankly of people with mental health disorders, those sorts of things. But as you are and all the listeners are aware of, the pandemic really illuminated to a much sharper degree other inequities having to do with race and culture and really all the things. It suddenly, everything was intensified. And I, to be fair, I would have to say that started before the pandemic due to the last presidency. And there was so much vitriol, and it unleashed a lot of hate in our country and in our state, to be acknowledged and supported if you were racist or in any way opposed to other people having equality. And so it felt like we really needed to be more intentional and take a bigger make our efforts larger in terms of acknowledging the inequities and illuminating how we try to deal with them and come up with new strategies moving forward.
Okay.
So that's really where this all came from. It was a team decision. Certainly I've been pushing for it, but there's nobody inside the Center for Innovative Practices who disagrees with it. And we were very pleased to already have been aligned with Dr. McFarlane and in her work in Ohio. And so it was a perfect fit for us.
Great. So I should want to check myself here on protocol. Do both of you have preferences regarding Dr. Beale, Dr. McFarlane, or Bobbi, or Kynetta?
I'd rather be Kynetta Sugar.
Okay.
And I'm fine too with Bobbi. It is not, I'm not a big title user, so.
I kind of knew that about both of you. But, it's good to check. So thank you, because I think I was already doing that. So it just caught me.
I think it's interesting that you even asked that during a discussion about equity and inclusion,
right?
Because titles play a role in this as well. And it cuts both ways, right? I think that I'm fine with my title. I'm happy to be a clinical psychologist and all the training and education that entailed. And yet it doesn't make me more or less deserving of respect and treatment and inclusion.
Right.
And for me, in terms of the title, in terms of, because I've often worked with marginalized communities, I come in and I have like this power difference already. Because I feel like me saying doctor just kind of like highlights it. And so I'm more in terms of like, okay, you know that I have this amount of knowledge in terms of being a doctor. It shows you that I did some extra work in terms of knowledge wise. But then after that, I don't need to kind of walk it around the room.
Yeah. Got it. Good. Thanks. I appreciate that. So Kynetta, can you talk a little bit about what you are bringing to this role of coordinator?
Well, I do feel like just even within myself, I represent a number of marginalized communities. I'm African American, I'm half Caribbean, so I'm half first generation American, I'm a female, I'm a queer individual. I have sciatica now, so I have disabilities in terms of my body. I have ADHD, so I'm neurodivergent. So I started school as a parent, a single parent. So just within myself, I can see some of those.
Mhm.
And then I also recognize that I also had privilege in terms of growing up middle class, growing up in Washington, D.C., an area that was predominantly Black. So I got buffered from some of the racism that other people that I experienced in Ohio have.
Mhm.
So in terms of these things, these have always been things that I've always been aware of. And I was always grounded in a home where culture and education and history were always important. So I feel all of that kind of framework, I brought all of that into psychology.
Mhm.
And in terms of just coming into psychology, my focus was also Africana studies. So really looking at how does culture overlay with this, and where do they not meet up, and how do I deal with that? And is it okay to be inherently different because I am of another culture than the culture that's proposing the education that I'm following?
Right.
So these types of questions and this perspective, and how does this fit, and then how does this align with also the people and systems that I'm dealing with, have always kind of been a part of my framework in terms of just thought process.
Yeah. Well, it makes me think about, a term that, has been more, common in the last, couple of years, and that is, authenticity and bringing our authentic selves to whatever we do. And having not only the confidence to do that, but also in some ways feeling maybe responsible to do that, that this is what and who I'm bringing to this discussion. So I think that's really important. So thanks, I appreciate that. And I think it, provides a good context for not only the role, one of the roles here that you have with the center, but also for the center deliberately expanding its portfolio to make sure that a variety of those experiences and quote differences are acknowledged and part of how we think about and feel about the people that we're working for and the communities that we're working for. So thanks. I wanted to move into the looking at, I think it's the 4 topic areas, maybe 4 topic areas that are going to be part of the series. And the first one that I'm looking at, and I'm not doing necessarily these in order, is titled Understanding Implicit Bias and Structural Racism. That to me sounded like kind of an overarching and and a fundamental cornerstone. So I'm wondering if you can give us the kind of the 30,000 foot view of what that means and where you're going to take that information. And this is a Kynetta and Bobbi question, your co-presenters on these topics. And why is this, and understanding this inclusion and bias and implicit bias and structural racism, why is that important to developing a system of care?
Let me jump in here first, because Kynetta and I did not develop this training. The other trainings that both she and I do are almost always self-developed. Kynetta does great research on certain topics for us. But this particular training, the original title is Trauma-Informed Family Engagement. And it includes things like structural racism, implicit bias, and all sorts of related topics, because this was an effort that came out of OMAS, the Ohio Department of Mental Health and Addiction Services, specifically their early childhood division or department. I'm afraid I'm not going to know all the right names and titles of things, but it came directly as a brainchild of Dr. Valerie Alloy, an African-American woman who is, she's since moved departments, and I think she's in grants and development or something like that. But she was very concerned that things were interfering with our ability to engage with families. And in her role with the early childhood division, families with infants and very young children. And that we were unaware of how our own biases interfered with that engagement, and that we were also to some degree unaware of the amount of structural or systemic racism and oppression exists within our systems. So she, I think she probably got some grant money or some funding to help this project get developed. And I also want to give a tip of the hat to the folks down at Hopewell Healthcare, Hopewell, we should probably try to get that right, but they're a behavioral health center down in southeastern Ohio. And they did a tremendous amount of work putting this training together. Then I heard about it. And honestly, I only heard about it being an engagement training. And I was like, I'll go be a trainer for this engagement thing, and was stunned to realize that it was really an anti-racism training, has a big anti-racism flavor to all of it. And I was so shocked that I had to stay after and talk with the developers and say, why did you say it's just family engagement when really it's this? And they, we had big conversations about it. And this was back in 2019. And they said, we didn't think people would sign up for it. We didn't think people were interested in this. But of course, by the time I got my hands on it, and I said to them, can we morph it to be what we need it to be, but honor the content that you have in there? And they said, yes, absolutely, that we want it to have legs around the state here, and to let as many people as possible engage in it. And so I right away reached out to Kynetta and said, hey, can you partner with me on this? I think it would be best if there were two of us going at this. And we posted it, and we broke Zoom because we had so many people sign up for it initially that we have limits to our Zoom meetings, and the limit was 300, and we had close to 500 people registered. And so it was a bit dramatic in the beginning because we just couldn't quite get our IT selves pulled together, but clearly the interest was out there. This was not just us saying we have to pay attention to this stuff. Oh, because when I posted it as a training, I posted it as trauma-informed family engagement, structural racism and implicit bias. So people knew what they were getting into.
Got it.
And so that, I just thought you should know the origin story of that particular training.
Sure, duly noted for the contributors. And I know that you all contributed your various pieces and parts as well, but thanks for that. I think it's always important to acknowledge where things come from. And in our child and family systems, we tend to do a lot of borrowing and sharing. And so acknowledging that, I think, is really important. So the 30,000-foot view of this training that 500 people plugged into their computers. What did you touch on? What did you bring to that group of folks?
I think a lot of them walk out of the training very shocked about like the structural aspect of racism, because most of the people in the training are white. So it's not shocking to communities of color because this is their lived experience. However, the way that systems work and the way that systemic racism works is that for it to work well, it works well best for like white people not to be aware of it, right? Like that's actually part of the structure. So a lot of people come out like really shocked in terms of like, there's a section where we specifically go through like the laws, and we can show you like through the laws how like things are like quite clearly unequal. And it is very shocking, like, that it is codified in terms of, like, again, that structural aspect, because a lot of people think about racism as, well, I'm not racist because I don't hate you because you're Black, and don't really get how it's racist to say to me that, like, the police are a problem, like how that's racist to say that to a person of a community of color, because we have a very different experience with that system. And so I feel like that is like the biggest kind of like surprise for people, is like, all of this stuff has existed and I never knew about it.
Yeah, I think, and isn't that the core of any really good, exciting, relevant, meaningful training for people to have aha moments? I mean, a lot of our trainings are to reinforce what we know, or to bring us to a new level of what we know, or to add a component to what we know. And this certainly does that too, but it also, like you said, it also unlocks, information and data. And like you said, legal language that clearly, I think, helps people begin to, whoa, like you said, just like, whoa, who knew? Well, like you said, a lot of folks knew, and a lot of folks didn't and don't. So thus it continues to be, a topic area that we're going to have to keep focusing on. Any little snippets of feedback that you got from folks? I mean, that was a really good one. The notion of who knew, like, oh my gosh, I can't believe I'm at this point in my life and unaware. But I'm wondering if there were other themes that came back from your audience around what they took away.
A couple of themes for me were, I'll go with some classic ones that we probably could have seen coming. One would be that we would occasionally have a white guy pushing back a little bit and saying, I don't know that what you're showing us says that, or why aren't we looking more at the research around white kids? Why do we just pay attention to the Black kids? And which is hysterical, because of course we never pay attention to the Black kids, and that's well documented, and except to get them in trouble or blame them for things. And it was interesting. We sort of had to wander through this a few times to figure out, how do you handle that? Do you engage with it and try to give responses back? Do you try to ignore it? Do you, it's really interesting, because, you're responsible for several hundred people who want the information and have signed up for it. And generally, there's only a couple who will speak up, especially if they're going to be critical. And so there's a learning curve there for us in that. In addition, I think some common responses, I know I got a lot of thanks. Yes. Lots of people would send us messages through the chat, or even emails afterwards saying, wow, I needed that, and this was a really good thing. Some of the people will be BIPOC and say, thank you, because I hardly ever hear white people acknowledging this, and so they'd be speaking specifically to me. I don't know what kind of messages Kynetta was getting.
I get totally separate messages from Black people going like they're more upset, usually, the messages that I get, in terms of like that it's more frustrating for them that other people don't know this information and how shocking it is. And so they're often like contacting me like, I can't believe that they don't know. Like, how can they not know? And so that, and appreciation in terms of like, I'm so happy that this is being talked about. So it's both. And we have totally separate conversations than what's going on outside in the.
Sure. Well, and even with 500, I don't know if you had 500 little tiny faces on your screens, but with even with just knowing that there's 500 people out there, the fact that you created a safe space that allowed people, regardless of their opinion, to participate in expressing and learning and hearing then other people's perspectives. So I think that's quite an achievement, especially in this Zoom age. When you're live with people, there's a certain energy and there's a certain, whatever that you can do to help shape things. It feels like it's harder to do that this way. But I think the two of you sound like you really accomplished a place where people felt, regardless of where they came on the thought continuum, to be able to say stuff. And that's important. Those are important messages. So,
as a trainer,
Mhm.
it felt important to me because for one of the few times in my life, I felt like I could actively do something about racism. And certainly, like many good white people, I try to do the right thing a lot, but it doesn't often feel like you make much of an impact, especially when you're trying to not do something. If you're trying to not be racist, it's hard to whole nother conversation about being anti-racist, which
Right.
is a new way to frame things for me. But sometimes it feels like it's not active enough. And this was a really good way to be able to put a lot of information out there and let people respond and react to it.
Right.
And overall, it's been very, very successful.
Right.
I was trying to look as we were talking here, how many people I think we've trained over the last 2 years, really. And I'd say we're pushing 1,000.
That's great. That's great. Well, so moving on from that particular topic, and I know that these are not intended to be siloed per se, that they're, that the boxes around the descriptions of these sessions are, at least as I read them, are pretty permeable in that, there's a lot of crossover, there's a lot of this from that, but they still have a focus. And the other one I'd like to talk about is the, understanding the culture of poverty, because in that description for that, I think duly noted that this is an area that often goes unaddressed. And so could you talk a little bit more about the lens of the culture of poverty and how that influences the work that folks do and how people experience the work?
So this is actually the training that got me started working with the Center for Innovative Practices, because I developed this training when I worked at Nationwide Children's Hospital. And so I've always worked in community mental health. So community mental health and working with underserved communities has always been a part of my background, but I grew up middle class. So this is not like my cultural aspect, but I've always also done, I'm a diehard Girl Scout. And so I've always done like a high level of also like community service, even working on the undergrad degree. And so I've always worked in these communities. And so I both like believe some of the stereotypes about the communities and didn't. And so I would hear other people say stuff about like the community and it would really bother me. And I could tell how they were like not understanding parents or understanding parents' perspectives. And that's what like made me want to do the training in terms of like doing supervision with others and just being inside of meetings and like hearing things that bothered me, that like were offensive, but I didn't quite like know what all to do with it. And so that's when I started really like investigating and looking at, okay, this is a different culture and the rules of like society are based off of middle class culture. The rules of psychology are based off of middle class culture and norms, right? And so what happens when you're outside of that norm? How do people look at you and how do they view you? Your differences are often looked at as things that are wrong. And I totally get that as like a person of color, that my differences that are different than European, like me being louder, will be just looked at as wrong versus different. And so I saw that same thing happening with a lot of my clients, and clinicians not being able to connect with clients in the same way based off of some of those stereotypes. Not understanding why interventions weren't working because of this belief system that people in poverty should just accept whatever it is that they get, even if they don't like it, or if it's not fun. There's this like belief system that they should just kind of like accept things and be okay with it. And we can have that same prescription if we're talking about doing this thing with your kid that like who wants to follow this routine, and then I get mad at you that you didn't do it, versus another parent who's middle class. I would have empathy because I can understand more, versus the parent in poverty. Well, why don't you just want, like, you should just do that because don't you want them to stop? Versus the other parent, I would be more like trying to put myself in their viewpoint and seeing it and trying to understand. I saw that with people in poverty, there was just more of this expectation of like, just do it, just accept it. Mm-hmm. And so I just wanted to learn more about that and be able to help clinicians see that and see that these are just differences.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I think framing that as, like you said, a cultural issue, you know, a cultural appreciation, a cultural awareness, a cultural education. I mean, not unrelated to the conversation we just had about implicit bias, you know, learning, kind of opening up. Oh, okay, so I was trained this way to do this intervention this way. Like you said, doesn't seem to be working all the time. And what do I need to understand better to help make that more effective and to make the care, the help, the support that I'm trying to give here land in the right place, you know, as opposed to, you know, whatever. So yeah, I think helping people think about it from a cultural aspect, because I think it seems to me, and certainly correct me, it's been a few years since I've been directly involved in the system of care, but the notion of cultural competency, you know, has really evolved within a system of care. And so I think people were perhaps somewhat familiar with the notion of thinking of things from a cultural point of view. So I think it seems like framing poverty within that framework may have been really helpful to people to think about it that way, that cultural competence isn't, quote, only about language, about place, about, you know, various things like that.
People in our country hear culture and just go to race.
Yeah.
And don't think of like, for most of the things, I'm really thinking about like marginalized communities. I'm more thinking about like people who haven't like had a voice. And in terms of like, and also thinking about power structures. And in terms of power structures, people in poverty don't have power. And so in comparison to people who have money. And so thinking about, is their viewpoint the viewpoint that's actually being looked at when we think about things? Often no. Things come from a viewpoint generally of the people in power. Like that's the viewpoint that we see things through. And so we really have to be intentional to really think about, how do these other communities see things? And then how does this information hit them?
Right. And I think I think a lot of folks could, you know, kind of roll through their heads when there were times that they approached something from their own point of view and then began to learn how to expand that and realize, oh, there's a whole nother half dimension, you know, quadrant, whatever you want to call it, that was totally outside of my orbit, but now it needs to be in my orbit if I'm going to be in this work, if I'm going to be in this, you know, commitment to people. It's got to be in my orbit. So good. Bobbi, anything about that particular session you wanted to add, or topic area?
No, although it does make me think about the only framework that I could find before talking with Sugar and asking her to put something together for us was this piece that had been done for years, really, off of a book written by a white woman about the culture of poverty, and that was Ruby Payne. And actually, I thought she was a Black woman for years. I'd never seen a picture of her. I just assumed, because of the kind of information she was digging into, that she had that background, but she did not. And so I was very happy that we could take some of the ideas from there and find a better way to touch on these topics and be more inclusive with that information.
Yeah. Okay. So, so kind of segueing to the session that's titled Behavioral Health for All Youth and Families in Ohio. So in that description, there was, at least how I read it, was there was some like connecting the dots between the emergence of trauma awareness, again, because we can relate that to many things we've talked about now. Again, awareness, beginning to think about, oh my, I just read an article this morning, you all have probably seen it, about, despite the years of focus and trainings we've been doing on trauma, and granted it's huge and still a long way to go, and this article was particularly about the uptake of trauma-informed care within the medical community and the progress that needs to be made there. It was significant.
It was shocking to read the article. It's kind of shocking.
Yeah. So, here we are, a number of years into it, lots of data, as the article points out, lots of research. It's not like just an idea that somebody had, we should start doing this, but we have a lot of evidence to suggest that we ought to be doing this on a regular and routine basis. So when you think about equity in behavioral health for all kids and families in our system of care, and that intersection with trauma, what's the expectation of that session, if you will, or that topic? What's the hope for where that's going to go and land on people, with people, not land on, with people?
I hope with that one, well, what I was looking at in terms of that one is that, yes, we recognize like that trauma is important. And we're getting that the diversity and equity inclusion part is important. So really what I wanted to do was look at, is mental health equitable to people? And we have a lot more information in terms of on race. So I started there because when we look at marginalized communities, one of the things that we know overall is that they don't have enough research. Out of the marginalized communities, the most research that you will find will be on race, right? And so in terms of that, that kind of almost gives me like a frame point in terms of like, where can I look at for some research to kind of like pull apart in terms of like, does this stuff seem inequitable? And when we pull it apart and look at the experience of people that are getting behavioral health services, we have information really well on race. And we also, in terms of looking also in terms of like the queer community, they are not having a positive experience in terms of getting mental health services. So understand that. But then also want people to have some understanding of like, what do all these different words and stuff mean? Because one of the things of living in the society that I grew up in, where we're just all equal, and the way that we're all equal is that we don't really talk about race. Everybody's equal, but we just don't talk about it. Is that people aren't really educated about like what these terms are. So I want to give them some like basic like terminology, But then I also want to give them that education about power, because that one may also be one that they're really not aware of. And the conversation of power opens up the conversation more, because we're not just looking at race, we're looking at power structures in terms of like all of these marginalized communities. And so then really talking about, what does multicultural social justice look like in terms of in behavioral health? And then looking at, what are like the ways that we want to like address power and ethnicity inside of therapy? And then like, what are different strategies based off if you're like a white clinician or if you're a clinician of color to discuss, like actually discuss race and treatment. So I'm an experiential person. Thank you, Bobbi Beale. So I like to do lots of like role plays and stuff. So giving people also the opportunity to have these conversations, recognizing that, as I said, most of us grew up in societies where this was not something that you were taught to do. This was not something that I was taught to do in my training programs. So if you weren't taught how to do this, it's both difficult to do it and difficult to tell somebody what to do about it in supervision. So we want to actually give people like the opportunity to practice.
Yeah, I think that idea of opportunity to practice is really, really key. We talk about, content training that, how do we know that this will actually impact how somebody thinks about and then operationalizes what they do and how they practice? And I mean, then there's obviously all kinds of, training expectations, but when it comes to the practice world, we want you to be able to take this into the world that you're there with. I think is really key. I like that idea a lot, that, for any of us to get comfortable, or whatever word you want to use, with something takes practice. And it takes practice within a space that allows you to kind of stumble and fall over and hurt your head, and be able then to also internalize that experience as, okay, I need to use that too. So yeah. Bobbi, any thoughts? I see your head.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that at the end, that I think one of the things that all of the trainings do, and one of the intentions that I had behind it all, was to create these spaces for people to not only learn things, but have a space where they could ask questions, where they could try things out, where they could figure out what's important and what's not as important. And there's a lot of language flying around about equity, diversity, inclusion stuff. Are they brave spaces, or are they safe spaces? And should we be mixing cultures and races while we learn, or should we just go off by ourselves and try to learn it? And so I just felt that what we needed to do was broaden the topics that we were offering out there and make more space for people to come together and learn about it. So you're talking about, and you're working your way through a slate of presentation style trainings that she's put together for us, and they're great. But we also have her hosting drop-in sessions and learning communities, and helping with consultation, and just sort of trying to help people understand that this understanding needs to be woven into all of our work.
Right.
And we have to be able to talk about it if we're going to make progress and acknowledge some of these oppressive or inequities, these things that we see out there. So that's kind of the bigger idea, the big picture of having somebody like Dr. McFarlane in here, so that it's not just like, here's this thing, here's this one great training, as great as it is.
Right.
It doesn't do it for everybody, nor can it possibly be expected to. And so what we really want to do is make this wide array of things available to people to help understand how, in some ways, DEI stuff is as important or on the same level as being trauma informed. And it has to be a part of how we think and move forward in the world in order to make a measurable impact.
Well,
I would say that DEI is being trauma informed. Like, I don't see how you can be trauma informed if you don't take into consideration DEI. Like one of the things we talk about a lot is like cultural trauma in terms of even the not believing that your like community has even experienced trauma is a part of like the trauma experience of a lot of marginalized communities. So to me, you really can't be trauma informed if you don't take into consideration DEI.
Well, and something that each of you mentioned, or two different things that each of you mentioned, was, one, Bobbi, was, like you said, kind of, broadening the platform, for the discussion, to make the content, land in a certain place. And Kynetta, the thing that you said that also stuck in my head, and we also know from trainings, is that critical role of supervisors, that critical role, because if we're going to have somebody whose role is to support us, mentor us, push us, shape us, if they don't come to us with that information that's needed, then, it's going to be a harder journey for an individual clinician to make those steps. So I think the deliberate focus on also on supervision, and ultimately, obviously, organizationally, that it becomes part of, the bigger picture as well. And Kynetta, you mentioned something that takes us, I think, to the last last big area around affirming care for genderqueer youth and families. Say more about that, where that impetus for that particular focus comes from.
Well, for years I've done a more general training that I call supporting LGBTQ youth and families. And that's more of like an overview for clinicians that may have had like experience like working. When I say LGBTQIA+, that also equals queer to me. So I use those two interchangeably. So when working, like they may have worked with like a queer kid or family, but need like a little bit more like history. So I do this like intro training that gives you some history and then gives you some information about the Family Acceptance Project that really focuses on trying to increase affirming behaviors like in a family. So we have that training, and one of the things that I got afterwards was people wanted more training specifically about transgender youth, and they just feel like they needed to know more. And as I said, that first one is like overview. So the second one was to go more specifically into transgender mental health and physical health, to hit more of asexual youth and also non-binary youth. So to really focus on that, because transgender youth in terms of that is a specialty area. So there is a lot of information that is specific to that area, but to just give clinicians like more information, more depth, and to also do a big job of really getting them to understand that working with these communities is social justice. So a big part of that training goes into power and like how these like individuals have a lot more difficulty in terms of like navigating in like everyday society. So really helping clinicians to understand like there's a big advocacy role that goes in terms of like working with these kids that are more non-gender queer, more like non-appearing typical kids. Like they have more difficulties. And so really making sure that if you're going to get into this area, that you understand that this part is also a part of the work, that advocacy is a part of the work, and that it's important for the kids and families to know that too.
Right. Bobbi, any thoughts on that?
Nothing to add there.
Okay. And, when you talk, Kynetta, about advocacy, and Bobbi, you talked about this too, we certainly can't ignore the moment we're in right now in terms of the need for advocacy on all of the issues we've talked about. This one particularly has been, in the spotlight recently. So the more we can support, inform, educate, move people into those advocacy roles to counterbalance some of the other stuff, I'll say, since we're doing a podcast, I'll monitor myself. So great. I mean, it's a really impressive slate of information that you're offering. And I guess as a way of kind of wrapping up is to just ask in general. I know this is like, kind of a big question, but so when I think of all of these things, holistically as part of a bigger system of care development, what are your hopes or plans going forward from this set of dialogues that you're creating to where, what's the next step? Where does it go from here? How do you see this informing other pieces and parts of the center and the work of the center in relation to Ohio's system of care?
One of the things that I think that is very cool is the increase of the number of participants of juvenile justice that I've seen come into the trainings. One of the areas that the center is doing is working with juvenile justice to make it more trauma informed. And me as a big prison abolitionist who doesn't believe in punishment as a way to deal with behavioral problems, I'm really excited to educate more in terms of the prison to school pipeline, and to look at the research that we have in terms of the kids who are in the system. How can we make it more trauma informed, and what can we do if there still is a system? What can we do to help these kids not get involved? And so really excited about that. And then also neurodiversity in terms of ways that we can be more affirming, thinking about neurodiversity in terms of that's in the spectrum of normal behavior, just in terms of talking about queer people, that's in the spectrum of normal behavior.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Bobbi?
I am both encouraged and overwhelmed by our venture into juvenile justice circles, because I'm super encouraged because the project that we share with Cuyahoga County is fabulous. And we have great attendees and people really digging in and trying to figure out how do we keep our lens on all the right things and really help these kids, as opposed to, they're a very punitive system. That is their bread and butter there. But I find them to be really open and hardworking, and it's worth it to do that kind of work. But then I have to sit back and think, my gosh, this is one county in one state. And I feel like a lot of it is new to them. And I'm like, holy crap, how many kids are being locked up and punished because they don't have the benefit of a trauma consultant checking on their cases, and somebody with an eye to equity issues and those sorts of things. I hope it catches on. I hope we do more of it, but it's so daunting to think how giant these problems are.
Yeah, and going back to kind of the moment we're in, which feels like we are on a very thin line here in terms of potential shifting of how juvenile justice has been seen. We're kind of coming off of a time of looking at best practices, looking at in-home services, looking at intensive, home-based care. And I am a little nervous.
I am too.
a
I'm
little
a lot
nervous.
nervous. You're a little, I'm a lot nervous.
Okay, so a lot nervous about this point we seem to be at, where I'm fearful of the possibility of losing that perspective, because, you know, Bobbi, as you said, I mean, you know, if you go back to the, you know, over 100 years ago, when juvenile justice was established, I don't think you'll find the focus on punishment. The focus was on rehabilitation, however you want to interpret that word, but that was the focus of juvenile justice. It was a recognition that kids, young people that get in trouble, or whatever term you want to use, or find themselves in trouble, that the response is not to be punitive, it is to be rehabilitative, it's to be supportive. And so how do we, if you will, get back to that perspective? And, you know, you're right, we have a lot of folks doing some good work under the juvenile justice umbrella, that's for sure. And Ohio has I think, deservedly some pride in its work, but man, it's huge and there's lots to do. And like I said, I get concerned about where we are in this particular time.
So thinking about that, one of the things that I do take hope from is, despite the current tenor in our nation, despite the pushback from people who want to get rid of critical race theory, want to get rid of discussions, want to say you're not allowed to say you're gay, you know, all of these things, we still have information coming to us nationally. So for instance, I got an email yesterday from the National Reentry Resource Center, which has to do with juvenile justice and kids coming back into the system. Mm-hmm. And I skimmed through their offerings, their webinars and things like that, and they're on the right track.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Even at the national level, even though the nation seemed to have turned hard right, you know, 6 years ago. And so, but the role of honoring trauma when you're serving returning youth, and being aware of traumatic brain injury, culturally responsive behavioral health reentry programming. I mean, these are the topics that are coming to us from national sites. And so that gives me some hope that it's not just us. And I know that, and I do, but sometimes it does feel like that when I feel like, wow, Sugar and I are the only two people in Ohio who are going around doing this at the moment. And I know that's not true with the Kerwin Institutes and things like that, but you get to working and you realize how many people don't understand and don't know. It can feel very overwhelming, but I do take heart in the fact that national, state, and local places are all queuing up to take a shot at how do we manage this even in these times.
Yeah, and I would say, I don't say this with any, you know, necessarily deep knowledge of this, but I think it's true. I think one of the reasons you're seeing what you're seeing in terms of the content area for that organization and OJJDP and, you know, various other, is because there's been about a decade of reframing. There's been about a decade of rethinking how we've been doing things with kids in the justice system. And I think what's come to the top is exactly what you've talked about. And that's my concern, is that we've spent this time, 10 years plus, kind of getting people here. And we all know that things are fragile. And so what do we need to do to make sure that that is the arc that we keep following, as opposed to perhaps taking a right-hand turn to a different approach? So that's, so you're right. I'm pleased when I look at those things and think, yes, those are the right approaches, but we are in a time where I think that's going to get challenged more. And same with child welfare, I think is, in a similar spot. So, and me, Bobbi, I've always believed that the intersection of behavioral health, child welfare, juvenile justice is still an area that requires us to be very strategic and thoughtful about how we approach those areas. So, well, listen, I want to give you both a chance to say anything at this point as we kind of wrap up. Thoughts, comments? And
Well, I think we're at the perfect point in history to be doing exactly what we're doing.
I think you're
I think the opportunity for the center to participate in Ohio Rise and this idea that these youth who struggle in one system are likely struggling across systems. And for us to acknowledge that in more than just yeah, that's probably true, but to acknowledge it and do things about it. It feels like that is happening. My huge sorrow and concern is that our workforce is so depleted and so overstretched. The opportunity, the money's flowing for us to do this multi-system work. The programs are lining up and we know what is effective and what helps. We're weaving it with DEI and trauma stuff, and we have no workforce to implement it. So everything's great, everything's awful. I just constantly swing between the two.
Yeah. Well, and FYI, our next podcast, which will probably be in May, is going to focus on workforce. So
so you'll have all the answers then?
That's right. That's right. So stay tuned. Wait a couple months. We'll have all the answers, in May for
Perfect.
you on workforce. And we're going to do I think a special section within that on telehealth as well. But Kynetta,
I just encourage anybody to come to the trainings. I encourage you to reach out if you have any ideas about like other topics or some areas that you see like in your community that you feel like there should be more education on, or any areas that we're missing. That would just be helpful. But for everybody who's also come to one, I appreciate you all. All of my trainings have participation, and I get like awesome participation. I get really nice feedback. So doing this work feels very fulfilling from the people and the individuals that I get to interact with. So I just encourage more of y'all to come out.
Great. Thanks. Well, thanks to you both. This has been a great conversation. I hope our listeners will take your advice and check out the website and the page and the upcoming sessions, and to take advantage of what you just said, which is to reach out. And, I just saw this morning on the website that you now have the office hours, or I'm not sure if that's the right term, but kind of the drop-in trauma-informed consultation. I mean, that is like, that's such a great example of access, and being able to take some of what we've talked about, which, has been the big picture, and kind of bring it into, and how do we really operationalize that in your caseload, in your, with maybe a particular client within your organization. So I think that's great. And I think having those avenues of communication available to people is really critical. So thanks to you both for this conversation.
For equity, the CEUs are free. So there you go, in terms of another equity thing that I think is important. All the CEUs are free.
Okay, great. Perfect.
Yeah.
So I'm going to thank you again. I'm going to thank our producer, Matthew K. Weiland, for his expert help in doing our podcasts. And so I think that takes us home, as they say. So thanks to you both.